My husband flung his drink in my face at a party and told everyone that's what she deserves for looking at other men. The moment the red wine splattered across my face, everything stopped. Not just the music, not just the party chatter, but my entire world shifted on its axis, staining my pristine white blouse with a brutal, undeniable truth. The party had been a vibrant blur of laughter and clinking glasses, a warm, inviting hum under the soft glow of fairy lights strung across the patio. I was by the snack table, the aroma of cheese and crackers mingling with the perfume of blooming jasmine, making polite small talk with a woman named Lisa. The air was light, the mood festive. Then a sudden, wet crimson shock silenced it all, leaving behind only the sticky silence of disbelief and a raw, burning sensation in my eyes. Mark's friend, David, had walked over for a chip, a casual, everyday movement. I'd looked up at him, the way you acknowledge anyone who steps into your personal space, a fleeting, almost unconscious gesture that lasted maybe 2 seconds. There was no smile, no flirtation, just the quiet recognition of another human being. Mark was across the room, but he saw it. He always saw it. He walked toward me, a glass of red wine in his hand, a chilling silence preceding him. He didn't say a word. He just threw the entire contents of the glass straight into my face. The wine went everywhere, into my eyes, up my nose, soaking instantly into my crisp white blouse, blooming like a grotesque, crimson flower against the fabric. I stood there, utterly frozen, the shock so profound it stole my breath. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. He looked directly at the dozens of faces now watching us, their expressions a mixture of horror and awkwardness, and he said, "That's what she gets for looking at other men." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The music, which had briefly faltered, started up again, but it felt distant, surreal. David, the unwitting catalyst, stared at the ground, his face beat red, as if he wished the earth would swallow him whole. Lisa, the woman I'd been talking to, nervously fumbled for a napkin and pressed it into my hand, her eyes wide with a pity I couldn't bear, before she quickly melted back into the crowd, clearly wanting no part in this public spectacle. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly tight, and his voice was low, laced with a venom only I could hear. "We're leaving." I followed him, my legs moving on autopilot, because I honestly didn't know what else to do. My face was still dripping wine, my eyes burned, and my chest felt like it was caving in. On the drive home, the car was filled with his harsh words, not apologies. He told me I'd embarrassed him, that I'd been flirting with David right in front of everyone. I tried to defend myself, my voice thin and trembling. "I wasn't flirting, Mark." I just looked at him for a second. He scoffed. "A second was enough. You should know better by now." That phrase, it hit me like another slap. "You should know better by now." It echoed in the small, confined space of the car, wrapping itself around my throat. It meant this wasn't an isolated incident. It meant this wasn't the first time he'd punished me for something so ridiculously small, so insignificant. It meant there had been other incidents, countless moments I'd explained away or forgotten or convinced myself weren't that bad. The first year of our marriage, he'd gotten angry when I laughed too long at Daniel's joke at a dinner party. He hadn't thrown anything that time, no. He just gave me the silent treatment for 3 agonizing days until I, desperate for connection, apologized for making him feel disrespected. Me apologizing for his insecurity. The second year, he'd accused me of dressing too nicely for work, asking, "Who are you trying to impress, Sarah?" I started wearing baggier clothes, trying to shrink myself, to make myself less visible, just to avoid the arguments, to avoid the accusations that always followed. The third year, he'd checked my phone while I was sleeping. He'd woken me, his face inches from mine, demanding to know why a male coworker had texted me about a project deadline. I showed him the whole conversation, every innocent word, proving it was strictly professional. But it didn't matter. He still didn't talk to me for a week. Every single time something happened, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself he just loved me too much, that he got jealous easily. I told myself I could fix it, that I could be more careful, more mindful of how I acted around other men. But throwing wine in my face at a party, in front of dozens of people, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an act of brutal, public humiliation. It was abuse. And in that moment, shivering in the passenger seat, the smell of cheap red wine clinging to my hair, I finally had to admit it. Everything before it had been abuse too. When we got home, the house felt heavy with unspoken tension. I went straight to the bathroom, desperate to wash the sticky, burning wine off my face. He followed me, leaning against the door frame, watching me in the mirror as I turned on the faucet. He murmured, "I'm sorry, Sarah," but the words felt hollow, a prelude to the true message. "But you pushed me to it. If you'd just been more aware of how your actions looked to other people, I wouldn't have had to teach you a lesson." He even had the audacity to add, "I love you, and that's why I care so much about what you do." I looked at him in the mirror, really looked at him, for the first time in 4 years. He wasn't sorry. He was justifying. He wasn't loving me. He was controlling me. And the lesson he wanted to teach me wasn't about respect. It was about fear. A strange, cold resolve settled over me. I turned from the mirror, a mask of placid acceptance on my face. "I understand, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll try to do better." He smiled, a familiar, possessive smile, and hugged me from behind. "I knew you would," he whispered, pressing a kiss to my wine-stained hair. I let him believe everything was fine. I needed him to believe everything was fine. The next morning was Monday. Mark left for work at 8 a.m., like always. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I called in sick to my job. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady as I started packing. 2 suitcases. That's all I allowed myself. Clothes, important documents, the delicate silver locket my grandmother had left me. Everything else, the furniture, the photos, the memories we'd built, I left behind. I drove 3 hours to my sister Emily's house. She opened the door, her eyes immediately taking in my swollen face and the faint, sour smell of wine still clinging to me. She didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into a hug, led me inside, made me a cup of steaming chamomile tea, and said, "You can stay as long as you need, love." That night, Mark called. I let it go to voicemail. He called 12 more times. Then the text started, first worried, then angry, then threatening, then apologetic, then desperately pleading. The cycle repeated 3 times before I finally, with a shaking finger, blocked his number. Emily helped me find Chloe, a family lawyer who specialized in domestic situations. The following week, I filed for divorce. Mark tried to contest it. I woke up Tuesday morning on Emily's couch, the stiff cushions digging into my back. Dried wine was still crusted in my hair, and the sour, sticky smell hit me first. Then came the ache in my neck, a physical reminder of the uncomfortable night. My phone sat face down on the coffee table where I'd left it. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. 37 missed calls. All from him. The number I'd blocked had found other ways through, calls from numbers I didn't recognize, likely him borrowing phones or using work lines. I deleted the notifications without listening to any voicemails. Emily was already awake, moving around in the kitchen. I could hear the familiar gurgle of the coffee maker, the gentle creak of cabinet doors opening and closing. I sat up, my whole body heavy, as if I were moving through water. The full weight of what I'd done settled over me in a way it hadn't the night before, when I was running on pure panic. I'd left my husband. I'd left my house, my old life, everything familiar. There was no taking it back now. Emily appeared in the doorway, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. She handed me one, her eyes kind, saying nothing about how I looked or smelled. We sat at her kitchen table, and she pulled out a notebook and pen. "We need to make a list," she said gently, "of everything you have to do." I held the pen, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely write. Emily took it from me, her touch featherlight, and started writing herself. Lawyer at the top, then bank accounts, change of address, get important documents from the house. The list kept growing, filling 1 page, then starting on a second. Each item felt impossible, each one a stark acknowledgement that this was real and permanent. I thought about my grandmother's jewelry, still in my dresser drawer at home. The photo albums from our wedding. How my entire life now fit into 2 suitcases. Emily continued to write, cancel joint credit cards, change beneficiaries, update emergency contacts. The pen scratched across the paper, her neat handwriting looping across the lines. When she finished, she slid the notebook across to me. I stared at it, my throat tight, a knot of fear twisting in my gut. She squeezed my hand. We'll do it one thing at a time, Sarah. Together. After I showered, finally washing away the last of the wine smell, I called my work. My supervisor, Daniel, answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to take the rest of the week off for a family emergency. My voice cracked when I said it, and I hoped he couldn't tell I'd been crying. He immediately said, "Of course, Sarah. Take whatever time you need." Then his voice softened. "Are you okay?" I said yes, automatically, the reflex kicking in, a conditioned response from 4 years of hiding. He paused. I could hear him breathing on the other end. "Just take care of yourself," he said finally. "Your job will be waiting for you when you get back." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of Emily's guest bed and cried again, this time from the unexpected kindness. Emily drove me to the bank on Wednesday morning. We sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, the beige building looking utterly mundane, glass doors, potted plants in the lobby. But walking through those doors meant doing something I couldn't undo. It meant taking money that was ours and making it mine. It meant Mark would know I was serious. The woman at the desk greeted us with a professional smile. I explained I needed to separate joint accounts from my husband. Her smile remained, but I saw her glance at a colleague across the room. A silent conversation passed between them, a knowing look I pretended not to notice. She asked for my ID and account information. My hands trembled filling out the paperwork. She explained, with an almost practiced empathy, that since both names were on the account, I had every legal right to withdraw funds or close it entirely. Her words made me realize she'd had this exact conversation with countless women sitting in this very chair. The process took 2 agonizing hours. She had to verify my identity 3 times, get manager approval, print out statements going back years. Emily sat next to me the whole time, scrolling through her phone, but staying close enough that our shoulders touched, a silent anchor. When it was finally done, the woman handed me a folder with all the new account information. The joint account was now closed, she explained, and the funds had been split exactly in half between my new account and a check made out to Mark. I stared at the check sitting on the desk, $17,000. Half of everything we'd saved together. It felt both fair and, inexplicably, like I was stealing from him, even though I knew that made no sense at all. We drove to a different bank across town, one he'd never know, where I opened a completely new account. The representative there was younger and didn't ask questions. I deposited my half of the savings and watched the receipt print out, $17,000. It wasn't enough to live on for long, maybe 6 months if I was incredibly careful. But it gave me options. It gave me a chance to figure out what came next. That night, lying awake on Emily's couch, the unfamiliar darkness of her guest room pressing in, I thought about the money. In the morning, Mark would see that the account was empty. He'd see the check. He'd know I was planning to stay gone. Thursday morning came too fast. Emily drove me to the courthouse because my hands were shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel. The building was huge and gray, an imposing structure with metal detectors at every entrance. People moved with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. I felt utterly lost. Emily held my arm, guiding me through the security line where I had to empty my pockets and put my purse on a conveyor belt. The guard waved us through, and we stood in the main lobby, staring at a directory board with dozens of room numbers and department names that meant nothing to me. Chloe had texted me the room number, but I couldn't make sense of the building layout. A woman in a uniform asked if we needed help, and Emily explained we were looking for the family court clerk's office. The woman pointed down a hallway to the left, 3rd door on the right. We walked past people sitting on benches, some quietly crying, some arguing in hushed tones with lawyers in suits. The clerk's office had a long counter with bulletproof glass and a small opening at the bottom to pass papers through. I gave my name to the woman behind the glass, and she handed me a clipboard with forms attached. The forms asked for everything: my full legal name, Mark's full legal name, our address, how long we'd been married, whether we had children, whether there was domestic violence, whether I wanted a restraining order. My hand cramped up writing, and I had to stop twice to shake it out. The woman behind the glass watched me with tired eyes, like she'd seen hundreds of women fill out these exact forms. When I finished, she took the clipboard back and typed information into her computer for what felt like an eternity. Then she printed out more papers and slid them through the opening, along with a number on a slip of paper. "Wait in courtroom 3, she said. "The judge will call your case when it's time." Courtroom 3 had wooden benches like church pews and a raised platform at the front where the judge would sit. Maybe 20 other people were scattered around the room, all waiting for their own cases. Emily and I sat in the back row. I held the papers in my lap, reading them over and over without really understanding what they said. The legal language made everything sound cold and official, like my marriage was just a contract being terminated instead of 4 years of my life ending. A bailiff came in through a side door and told everyone to rise. The judge entered, a younger woman than I expected, maybe in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She sat down at the bench and started calling cases by number. People walked up to stand in front of her while she reviewed their paperwork. Some cases took 2 minutes, some took 20. I watched a man try to argue that his ex-wife shouldn't get full custody, and the judge cut him off mid-sentence, her voice sharp and clear, telling him that showing up drunk to pick up his kids meant he'd lost the right to argue. Finally, she called my number. I stood up, my legs feeling weak, and walked to the front of the courtroom. The judge looked at my paperwork, then at me. "Ms. Miller, are you requesting a temporary restraining order based on assault and threatening behavior?" "Yes," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "Please describe what happened at the party." I told her about the wine, about Mark's words, about him showing up at Emily's house and pounding on the door. "Do you have any evidence?" she asked. I showed her the police report from that night and the photos of my wine-stained blouse I'd taken before washing it. She studied the photos for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she asked, "Does your husband have a history of violent behavior?" I started to say no automatically, the old conditioning kicking in, but then I stopped myself. The silent treatments were violent in their own way. The phone checking was violent. The accusations and the isolation were violent. "Yes," I said, my voice gaining strength. "He has a pattern of controlling and threatening behavior over the past 4 years." She made notes on her computer, then looked up at me again. She asked where Mark worked, where I worked, and where Emily lived. I gave her all the addresses. She typed more notes, then printed something out. She signed it and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it down to me. It was the restraining order. She said it was effective immediately. Mark had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, from Emily, from my workplace, and from Emily's home. She said a process server would deliver the papers to him at his workplace tomorrow, and that if he violated the order, he would be arrested. "Do you understand, Ms. Miller?" she asked. "Yes," I said, a wave of dizzying relief washing over me. "Be safe," she said, and then called the next case number. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. I walked back to Emily, a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion coiling in my stomach. I showed her the papers. She squeezed my hand, her eyes welling up, and we left the courtroom. In the hallway, the tears I'd been holding back finally came, a torrent of grief and fear and relief. Emily pulled me into a corner, away from other people, and let me cry into her shoulder until I ran out of tears. We drove home in silence, and I stared at the restraining order the whole way. 500 feet. That was the distance that now had to exist between me and the man I'd been married to for 4 years. It felt both like too much space and not nearly enough. Friday, I spent going through the 2 suitcases I'd packed when I left. I laid everything out on Emily's guest bed to see what I actually had. 3 pairs of jeans, 5 shirts, 1 dress, underwear and socks, my toothbrush and some makeup, my birth certificate and social security card, my grandmother's jewelry. That was it. That was everything I'd grabbed in my panic to get out. I realized I'd forgotten my winter coat and all my sweaters. I'd forgotten the photo albums from our wedding and from trips we'd taken. I'd forgotten my grandmother's recipe box that I'd promised my mom I'd keep safe. I'd forgotten my favorite books and the blanket Emily had made me for Christmas 2 years ago. All of it was still in the house with him. I called Chloe and told her about everything I'd left behind. She said we could arrange a police escort to go back and get more belongings, but not until after Mark had been served with the restraining order papers. It's safer to wait until he knows there will be legal consequences if he tries anything, Sarah, she advised. So, I had to wait. I had to sit in Emily's house, wearing the same 5 shirts on rotation, sleeping under a borrowed blanket, while all my things stayed in a house I couldn't go back to. Monday morning, Chloe called me before I'd even finished my coffee. She said Mark's response to being served had arrived through his lawyer, Richard Hayes. Richard had sent a formal letter contesting the divorce. The letter claimed I'd abandoned the marriage without cause and stated that Mark wanted me to pay half the legal fees, since I was the one who'd chosen to leave. Chloe read parts of the letter out loud to me over the phone, and I felt sick hearing the words abandoned without cause. Like 4 years of controlling behavior and getting wine thrown in my face didn't count as cause. Like I'd just woken up one day and decided to destroy our marriage for no reason. Chloe's voice got firm as she explained this was a common intimidation tactic. She said his claims wouldn't hold up in court because I had evidence of abuse and threatening behavior. But she also said it meant the divorce would take longer and cost more money than if he'd agreed to proceed cooperatively. Expect him to fight everything, Sarah, she warned. To drag out every step of the process, to make it as difficult and expensive as possible. I asked her how much longer and how much more money. Probably 6 months minimum, she said, and several thousand more in legal fees. I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders. 6 more months of this. 6 more months of legal battles and court dates and him trying to punish me through lawyers and paperwork. 6 more months before I could actually be free. Wednesday morning, I woke up with my stomach in knots, knowing I had to face him in court. Chloe picked me up at 9 a.m., and we drove to the courthouse together while she explained what would happen during the hearing. The judge would review the temporary restraining order and decide whether to extend it based on evidence of ongoing threat. Richard would argue against it, and I might have to testify about what happened. The courthouse was old and intimidating, with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. We went through security and found the right courtroom on the 3rd floor. Chloe checked in with the clerk while I sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, trying to control my breathing. Then I saw him. Mark, walking down the hall with Richard. He wore a dark suit and tie, looking calm and professional, like he was heading to a business meeting instead of a hearing about abusing his wife. He glanced at me once, his expression neutral, almost concerned, as if he were the reasonable one and I was overreacting. That look made me question everything for a second. Had I blown things out of proportion? Was throwing wine really that bad? Maybe I should have tried harder to work things out. Then I remembered the burning in my eyes, the wine soaking through my clothes while everyone stared. I remembered him grabbing my arm and the cold way he justified it afterward. I remembered 3 years of walking on eggshells, changing how I dressed, apologizing for things that weren't my fault. The clerk called us into the courtroom, and we took our seats at separate tables. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She looked tired, like she'd heard too many of these cases. Richard stood up first, his voice smooth and practiced. He started talking about how Mark was a devoted spouse who made one mistake in a moment of stress. He said the wine incident was a one-time loss of control after I had provoked him by openly flirting with his friend at a party. He made it sound like I'd been throwing myself at David right in front of my husband. Then he talked about Mark showing up at Emily's house and called it a concerned spouse trying to check on his wife who disappeared without explanation. He twisted every single thing into a story where I was the problem and Mark was just reacting to my bad behavior. I felt sick listening to him. My hands were shaking, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep them still. Chloe squeezed my arm under the table, a silent reassurance, and I tried to focus on breathing. Then the judge started reading through the police report from the night Mark came to Emily's house. The officer had described him as aggressive and threatening, pounding on the door and refusing to leave when asked. The judge also reviewed photos of my wine-stained blouse that I'd given to Chloe as evidence. She looked at Mark over her reading glasses and asked if he had anything to say about the police report. He started to answer, but she held up her hand. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I am extending the restraining order for 6 months." She told him he needed to stay 500 feet away from me, my workplace, and Emily's residence. Any violations would result in immediate arrest and possible jail time. She looked directly at him when she said it, her gaze unwavering. Richard tried to object, but the judge shut him down, stating, "The evidence is clear that Mr. Miller poses a continued threat." The hearing was over in less than 30 minutes. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt both relieved and completely drained. Chloe reminded me this was just the beginning, that the actual divorce would involve many more hearings and legal battles. "But at least you have legal protection now, Sarah," she said. "At least there are consequences if he comes near you." We got lunch at a diner near the courthouse, and Chloe went over the next steps in the divorce process. That evening, Brenda, Emily's neighbor, knocked on the door holding a casserole dish covered in foil. She said she'd heard I was going through a hard time and wanted to bring dinner. She came inside, set the casserole on the kitchen counter, and then mentioned she had a friend who owned rental properties if I was looking for my own place eventually. Her kindness caught me completely off guard. I'd been expecting everyone to judge me, or ask nosy questions, or tell me I should have tried harder to save my marriage. But Brenda just smiled and said she'd been through a divorce herself years ago and knew how hard it was. She wrote down her friend's phone number on a piece of paper and told me to call whenever I was ready. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the phone number. The idea of having my own apartment felt both exciting and scary. I started looking at rental listings online that night after Emily went to bed. Everything affordable was either too close to my old neighborhood or in areas that didn't look safe based on the street view photos. The nice apartments in good neighborhoods cost more than I could afford on my salary, especially with the legal fees piling up. I realized how financially dependent I'd become during my marriage. Mark had always handled the money, made the big decisions about where we lived and what we could afford. I'd let him take control because it seemed easier than arguing. Now I was looking at tiny studios in sketchy parts of town and doing math in my head about whether I could survive on ramen and still make rent. The search made me feel small and powerless. Thursday afternoon, I was sitting on Emily's couch, scrolling through more apartment listings, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender name was someone I didn't recognize, but the subject line screamed, "We need to talk." My heart leaped into my throat. I opened it. It was a long message from Mark, going back and forth between apologizing for the wine incident and blaming me for provoking him. He said he loved me more than anything and couldn't understand why I was doing this to us. Then, the next paragraph accused me of being selfish and cruel for filing a restraining order and making him look like a monster. He said if I really loved him, I would come home, and we could work through this together. The message ended with him begging me to call him so we could talk like adults. Reading it made my chest tight, my hands shake. I called Chloe right away and read her the entire email. She asked me to forward it to her immediately. "Sarah," she said, her voice sharp with professional anger, "creating a fake email account to contact you is a clear violation of the restraining order." She explained that the email showed exactly the kind of manipulation and abuse cycle behavior she'd warned me about, the apologies and declarations of love mixed with blame and accusations, the insidious way he made his actions my responsibility. She told me to forward the email to the police as well and not to respond to him under any circumstances. I sent the email to both Chloe and the police department. Within a few hours, a detective called me back and said they'd traced the email to Mark's home IP address. They were going to arrest him for violating the restraining order. I felt a surge of relief, but also, surprisingly, guilt. Part of me still felt responsible for what happened to him, even though he'd chosen to break the law. The detective said they'd picked him up at his house and he'd spend at least one night in jail before he could post bail. That night, I had my regular therapy session with Dr. Eleanor. I told her about the email, the arrest, and how guilty I felt. She listened patiently, her expression calm. "Sarah," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "feeling guilty is a conditioned response. It's what happens after years of your husband telling you his actions were your fault." She explained that we needed to work on separating his choices from my reactions. He chose to violate the restraining order. He chose to send that email. Those were his decisions and his consequences, not mine. We spent the rest of the session talking about how to recognize when I was taking responsibility for things that weren't my responsibility. The next week, Chloe called to tell me the divorce was moving into the discovery phase. Both sides had to disclose all financial information, including bank statements, tax returns, pay stubs, and documentation of assets and debts. She said Mark's lawyer, Richard, had requested extensive documentation about my spending habits and work history going back 5 years. Chloe explained this was another intimidation tactic, meant to make me feel invaded and overwhelmed. She said we'd comply with reasonable requests, but push back on anything excessive or irrelevant. I spent the weekend gathering bank statements and pay stubs, organizing them into folders. Going through the financial records felt invasive, even though it was required. I could see every purchase I'd made, every paycheck I'd deposited, every bill I'd paid during our marriage. Then, buried within the statements, I found them. Charges spread across 3 months of statements, each one carefully hidden among normal purchases. $200 at an electronics store, $500 at a restaurant I'd never been to, $1,200 at some online retailer whose name I didn't recognize. The amounts got bigger each month, like he'd been testing to see if I'd notice. I took pictures of every statement with my phone and sent them to Chloe, along with a frantic message asking if this was legal. She called me back within 20 minutes. Her voice was grave. "Meet me at the police station tomorrow morning, Sarah. What your husband has done is identity theft and fraud." IF. Eltsick looking at the total again. $8,000 of debt in my name that I hadn't spent or agreed to. Chloe explained that opening accounts in someone else's name without permission was a crime, even between married people, and that the credit card company would likely remove the charges once we filed a police report. The next morning, I sat in a small room at the police station with Chloe beside me while a detective took my statement. He asked me to walk through how I discovered the card and whether Mark had ever asked permission to open accounts in my name. I told him no and showed him the statements on my phone. The detective made copies of everything and said they'd investigate, though he warned me that these cases could take months to resolve. Chloe helped me file disputes with the credit card company that same afternoon. The representative on the phone sounded sympathetic when I explained the situation and said they'd start an investigation into the fraudulent charges. She told me not to make any payments on the account while the dispute was pending. That evening, Emily's phone rang while we were making dinner. She answered it, and her expression changed immediately. She covered the mouthpiece and whispered, "It's Mark's parents. They want to speak with you." I shook my head emphatically. Emily nodded, then told them firmly that I wasn't interested in contact and that everything needed to go through lawyers now. I could hear his mother's voice getting louder through the phone, saying something about family and working things out. Emily repeated that all communication needed to go through legal channels and then ended the call. She looked at me, her eyes full of concern. "Are you okay?" I told her yes, but my hands were shaking again. The next few weeks, I spent every evening after work scrolling through apartment listings on my laptop. Most places were too expensive or too far from my job, or in neighborhoods that didn't feel safe. Brenda stopped by one night and mentioned that her friend owned several rental properties in a quiet area about 30 minutes from where I worked. She gave me the landlord's number and suggested I call him. I reached out the next day and explained that I was going through a divorce and needed a place quickly. The landlord's name was Frank, and he sounded understanding when I told him my situation. He had a 1-bedroom available immediately and offered to work with me on the security deposit since I was dealing with legal expenses. I drove out to see the apartment that weekend. It was small, but clean, with good locks on the doors and windows that faced a quiet street. The kitchen was outdated but functional, and the bedroom had enough space for my bed and dresser. Frank showed me around and explained that most of his tenants were single professionals or people going through transitions. He didn't ask too many questions about my divorce, which I appreciated. I signed the lease 2 days later. Moving day happened on a Saturday, exactly 2 months after I'd left Mark. Emily helped me load my 2 suitcases and the few things I'd bought into her car. We drove to my new apartment and carried everything up the stairs to the 2nd floor unit. The place felt empty with just my belongings scattered around, but it was mine. My sister gave me a housewarming gift that afternoon, a security camera system she'd ordered online. We spent the rest of the day installing cameras at the front door and the windows, and I added extra locks to every entry point. By evening, the apartment was as secure as I could make it. Emily hugged me before she left and told me to call if I needed anything. That first night alone, I barely slept. Every creak from the hallway or muffled sound from the street made me sit up and check the security camera feed on my phone. I got out of bed 4 times to test the locks on the doors and windows. Around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off, but woke up again at dawn, feeling exhausted. I had a therapy session with Dr. Eleanor that week and told her about the sleepless night and the constant checking. She explained that this kind of fear response was normal after trauma, and that my brain was trying to keep me safe by staying alert to danger. She said it would get better with time and practice feeling secure in my space. Work became the one place where I could focus on something other than the divorce, the apartment, and the legal battles. Daniel called me into his office one afternoon. I braced myself, expecting a lecture, but he told me he was giving me a small raise and more responsibilities on a new project. He said I'd been doing excellent work despite everything going on in my personal life. Most people would let their performance slip, Sarah, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice, but yours has actually improved. The extra money helped immensely with my financial situation, and having more to do at work kept my mind occupied during the day. 3 months after I'd left, Chloe scheduled the divorce mediation session. She explained that a court mediator named Thomas Stone would help us try to reach agreements on property division before going to trial. The mediation was held in a neutral conference room at the courthouse. I arrived early with Chloe, and we sat on one side of a long table. Mark came in 10 minutes later with his lawyer, Richard. He looked across the table at me with this wounded expression, like I was the one who'd hurt him. I felt the familiar pang of guilt start to rise in my chest, but then Chloe squeezed my hand under the table, and I remembered why I was there. Thomas started by explaining the mediation process and asking us to focus on practical matters rather than emotions. We spent the first hour going through the small stuff and reached agreements on most of it fairly quickly. I'd keep my car and my personal belongings. He'd keep his tools and his sports equipment. We'd split the wedding gifts based on who gave them. But then we got to the house and the car he drove, and everything stopped moving forward. Mark wanted to keep both and have me sign over my rights to everything. He argued that he'd paid more of the mortgage and that the house was in a neighborhood close to his work. I wanted my fair share of the equity we'd built together over 4 years of marriage. Chloe presented documentation showing I'd contributed to the household expenses and helped maintain the property. We went back and forth for over an hour without reaching any agreement. The mediation ended after 3 hours with most of the small issues resolved, but the big ones still deadlocked. Thomas said we tried our best, but that some cases just couldn't be settled through mediation. Chloe walked me to my car afterward and warned me that going to trial would add months to the process and thousands more in legal fees. I told her I understood, but that I wasn't going to give up what I was legally entitled to, just because Mark wanted everything his way. The following week, Dr. Eleanor mentioned a support group for domestic violence survivors that met every Thursday evening at a community center downtown. I was nervous about going, hesitant to share my story with strangers, but she said hearing other women's stories might help me feel less alone. I showed up to the first meeting and sat in the back of a circle of folding chairs. There were 8 other women there, ranging from their 20s to their 60s. The group leader asked if anyone wanted to share, and one by one, the women talked about their experiences. One woman, Laura, described how her ex-husband had violated his restraining order 6 times before finally leaving her alone. Her story scared me, making my blood run cold, but it also, in a strange way, prepared me for the possibility that Mark might not give up easily. She talked about how he'd show up at her work and her gym, places she went regularly. Each time the police would tell him to leave, but they couldn't arrest him because he was in public spaces. It took 6 violations and 6 police reports before the judge finally took it seriously and put him in jail for a week. The other women in the group nodded, a shared understanding in their eyes, like they'd heard similar stories before. I sat there feeling cold, even though the room was warm. The idea that Mark might do the same thing hadn't really occurred to me until that moment. I'd been so focused on the legal process and the restraining order that I hadn't thought about what would happen if he decided to test the boundaries. After the meeting ended, I drove home, checking my mirrors more than usual. Every car behind me felt suspicious, and I took 3 extra turns just to make sure nobody was following me. The next morning, I stopped at the grocery store near my apartment to pick up food for the week. I was in the produce section, comparing prices on apples, when I saw him. Mark was standing by the bread aisle, looking directly at me. He didn't move or say anything. He just stood there, holding a shopping basket, watching me. My hand started shaking so badly I dropped the apple one was holding. It rolled across the floor and stopped near his feet. But I didn't go pick it up. I turned my cart around and walked quickly toward the checkout lanes. Even though I'd barely gotten anything, my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I paid for the few items in my cart and left without looking back. In my car, I locked all the doors and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down enough to drive. He hadn't violated the restraining order technically. The grocery store was a public place and he was allowed to shop there. But he lived 20 minutes away, and there were 4 other grocery stores closer to our old house. He'd chosen this one because he knew I'd be there. 2 days later, I was getting coffee before work at the shop I'd been going to for the past month. I walked in and saw him sitting at a table near the window with a newspaper. He looked up when I entered, and our eyes met for just a second before I turned around and walked back out. I went to a different coffee shop 15 minutes away and showed up to work late without my usual morning caffeine. That afternoon, I called Chloe and told her what was happening. She asked if I had any proof, and I realized I didn't. No photos or videos or anything concrete. She told me to start documenting everything with my phone. Take pictures of him whenever you see him, Sarah. Note the date, time, and location. Build a record that shows a pattern of behavior. The next time I saw him was 3 days later at the coffee shop again. This time, I was ready. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of him sitting there before I left. He saw me do it, but he didn't react, just went back to reading his newspaper like nothing had happened. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw him 6 more times. Always in places near my apartment or my work. Always in spots where he was technically allowed to be, but where his presence felt profoundly threatening. I photographed him every time and wrote down the details in a notes app on my phone: date, time, location, what he was doing, how long I saw him for. Chloe filed a motion to modify the restraining order to include these specific locations. We had a hearing in front of the same judge who'd granted the original order. Richard argued that Mark had every right to shop and get coffee in public places. He said I was being paranoid and trying to control where Mark could go. The judge looked at my documentation: 9 sightings in 2 weeks at locations near my home and workplace when Mark lived and worked in a completely different area. She asked Richard why his client needed to shop at a grocery store 20 minutes from his house when there were multiple options closer. Richard said it was a free country and people could shop wherever they wanted. The judge wasn't buying it. She added the specific locations to the restraining order and warned Mark that his pattern of behavior looked like stalking. She said if he continued showing up in places where I regularly went, she would consider it harassment, regardless of whether they were public spaces. After the hearing, I felt safer, a small weight lifted, but also more isolated. I couldn't go back to my regular grocery store or coffee shop without risking another violation. I had to find new places and new routines, which meant giving up the small sense of normalcy I'd been building. At work that week, Jessica stopped by my desk and asked if I wanted to come to her book club. She said they met every other Thursday evening at a member's house, and this month they were reading a mystery novel. I almost said no automatically. The idea of being social, of sitting in a room with strangers, felt exhausting. But then I thought about how my entire life had become legal battles and therapy appointments and constantly watching over my shoulder. Maybe spending an evening with normal people, doing normal things, would be good for me. I told Jessica yes, and she smiled and said she'd text me the address. The book club met at a house in a neighborhood I'd never been to before. I showed up with the book I'd barely had time to read and a bottle of wine I'd picked up on the way. Jessica introduced me to the other women. There were 6 of them, ranging in age from late 20s to early 50s. They were friendly and welcoming, and nobody asked why I was there or what was going on in my life. We talked about the book for about an hour. I hadn't finished it, but I'd read enough to follow the conversation. Then we moved on to other topics. Someone's daughter was applying to colleges. Someone else had just gotten a promotion at work. Normal, everyday things that had nothing to do with restraining orders or abusive husbands. One woman mentioned she'd gone through a difficult divorce a few years back. She didn't go into details, but she said it had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done, and that she'd come out the other side stronger than she expected. She looked at me when she said it, like maybe Jessica had told her something about my situation, but her comment felt genuine and hopeful rather than pitying. Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in months. Being around people who treated me like a regular person instead of a victim or a legal case had reminded me that life could eventually feel normal again. For months after I'd left Mark, I met someone at the coffee shop I'd started going to on the other side of town. He was in line behind me, and we started talking while we waited. Just casual conversation about the weather and how long the line was taking. He asked if I came here often, and I said I just started coming a few weeks ago. He said he'd been coming for years and recommended their breakfast sandwiches. We talked for a few more minutes, and then he asked if I'd like to get coffee together sometime. My immediate reaction was panic, a cold dread seizing me, but he seemed nice and normal, and it had been so long since anyone had shown genuine interest in me that I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. We met the following Saturday for coffee. Just coffee and conversation in a public place during the daytime. He told me about his job in accounting and his dog and his hobby of building model trains. I told him about my work and kept everything else vague. The whole time, I was an anxious mess, watching the door. Every time someone walked in, I tensed up, expecting to see Mark. I couldn't focus on what this kind stranger was saying because I was too busy scanning the room and planning escape routes. After an hour, I made an excuse about needing to run errands and left. He seemed disappointed, but he said he'd like to see me again. I said maybe and knew I wouldn't. At my next therapy session, I told Dr. Eleanor about the date. She asked how it had felt, and I admitted I'd been too anxious to enjoy any of it. She said that was completely normal and that it was probably too soon for me to think about dating. She said I needed to focus on healing and rebuilding my sense of self before I could be ready for a relationship with someone new. Part of me felt relieved hearing that, like I had permission to not be ready, permission to not have to force myself to move forward faster than I could handle. Dr. Eleanor said healing wasn't linear and that I shouldn't rush myself just because I thought I should be over things by now. 6 months after I'd filed for divorce, Chloe called to tell me the trial date had been set. We'd be going to court in 3 weeks to settle the remaining issues about the house and the car. She said we needed to meet several times before then to prepare. She'd be doing practice questioning to get me ready for what Richard would ask. She warned me that he would try to make me look bad. He'd bring up things I said or did and twist them to make it seem like I was the problem in the marriage. She said I needed to stay calm and stick to the facts, no matter what he said. We met at her office 3 times over the next 2 weeks. She asked me hard questions about the wine incident and the years before it. She pushed me on details and challenged my answers the way Richard would. By the 3rd practice session, I felt more confident, but still scared about having to face Mark in court again. The week before the trial, Mark sent flowers to my workplace. The delivery person brought them to my desk with a card attached. I didn't open the card right away. I just stared at the bouquet, a beautiful, vibrant arrangement of roses, knowing it had to be from him. Jessica was walking by and saw the flowers. "Everything okay, Sarah?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I opened the card. The message was sickeningly sweet. He forgave me. He wanted to start over. We could fix things if I just came home. My hands started shaking again. I told Jessica I needed to refuse the delivery. She helped me carry the flowers back to the front desk and explained to the receptionist that I couldn't accept them. Then I called the police and filed a report for violating the restraining order. The officer who took my report said sending flowers to my workplace was a clear violation, since the order prohibited any form of contact. He said they'd be issuing a warrant for Mark's arrest. Mark was arrested that evening and spent 3 days in jail before his bail hearing. At the hearing, Richard argued that his client was just a man trying to save his marriage and that sending flowers was a romantic gesture, not a threat. The judge looked at Richard like he was insane. She pointed out that Mark had been explicitly ordered not to contact me in any way and that he'd now violated that order multiple times. She extended the restraining order for another full year and set a significantly higher bail amount. She told Mark that if he violated the order again, he'd be spending considerably more time in jail. Watching him get led back to the holding cell, I felt both satisfied and scared. Satisfied that he was finally facing real consequences. Scared about what he might do when he got out and realized I wasn't going to back down. The trial happened on a cold morning in late winter. I woke up at 5 a.m. because I couldn't sleep anymore and sat in my apartment watching the sun come up through my window. My hands kept shaking when I tried to hold my coffee cup. I got dressed in the clothes Chloe had helped me pick out the week before. Nothing too nice that would make me look like I was trying too hard. Nothing too casual that would make me look like I didn't take this seriously. Just a simple navy dress and flat shoes that wouldn't make noise when I walked into the courtroom. Emily picked me up at 7 a.m., and we drove to the courthouse in silence. She kept glancing over at me like she wanted to say something encouraging, but couldn't find the right words. Chloe met us outside the courtroom at 8:15 a.m. She went over everything one more time about how to answer questions and what to expect from Richard. She told me to look at the judge when I spoke and to take my time with my answers. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. There were only about 20 seats for observers, and most of them were empty. Mark sat at a table on the other side with Richard beside him. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, and his hair was cut shorter than usual. He looked like a different person, someone calm and reasonable who would never throw wine in anyone's face. The judge came in, and we all stood up. She was an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She told everyone to sit and started going through the preliminary stuff about what we were here to decide. Then Chloe called me to the witness stand. I walked up and put my hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Chloe started with easy questions about how long we'd been married and where we lived. Then she asked me to describe what happened at the party. I told the whole story, about standing by the snack table, about looking up when David came over, about the wine hitting my face and going in my eyes, about him saying that's what I get for looking at other men. About everyone watching and nobody saying anything. Richard objected twice during my testimony, but the judge overruled him both times. Then Chloe asked about the years before the party. I described the silent treatments and the phone checking and the accusations about my clothes. I explained how he'd made me apologize for laughing at someone's joke and how he'd shown up at my work without warning to check on me. Richard objected again and said I was bringing up irrelevant past incidents to make his client look bad. The judge told him the pattern of behavior was relevant to understanding the current situation. Chloe asked about the financial abuse. I told her about finding the credit card he'd opened in my name and the $8,000 in charges I never made, about how he'd controlled all our money and made me ask permission to buy anything. Richard stood up and said I was exaggerating normal marital financial management. The judge told him to wait his turn. Then Chloe asked about what happened after I left. I described the phone calls and texts, the showing up at Emily's house, the fake email account, the flowers he sent to my work after the restraining order. Richard tried to object again, but the judge cut him off and told him she'd hear his side when it was his turn. When Chloe finished, Richard stood up to cross-examine me. He asked if I'd ever been diagnosed with any mental health conditions. Chloe objected, and the judge sustained it. He asked if I'd been faithful during the marriage. I said yes. He asked if I'd ever lied to my husband about where I was going or who I was with. I said no. He asked if I thought it was normal for a wife to run away without warning and take half the money from their joint account. I said I didn't run away. I left an unsafe situation. He asked if I had any proof the wine incident actually happened the way I described. I said there were dozens of witnesses at the party. He asked if any of them had come forward to testify. I said no, but that didn't mean it didn't happen. He kept pushing, trying to make me sound vindictive or unstable, but I stayed calm and stuck to the facts, just like Chloe had taught me. When he finally sat down, I felt utterly exhausted, but relieved it was over. The judge called a 15-minute recess. Emily came up and hugged me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She said I did great and that anyone watching could see I was telling the truth. When we went back in, Chloe called Emily to testify. She described the night I showed up at her door with wine still in my hair. She talked about how scared I looked and how I kept checking the windows like I thought he might follow me. She described him pounding on her door at midnight and shouting that I needed to stop being dramatic. Richard tried to make it sound like she was biased because she was my sister, but she stayed calm and factual. Then Chloe called Jessica from work. Jessica testified about work events where Mark would show up uninvited and stand too close to me. About how he'd call the office multiple times a day to check on me. About how I'd started wearing baggier clothes and stopped going to happy hours. The judge took notes the whole time and asked a few questions of her own. After Jessica finished, Richard called Mark to testify. He walked up to the stand looking sad and defeated, a master of deception. He talked about how much he loved me and how he'd made mistakes, but that I was blowing everything out of proportion. He said the wine incident was a one-time loss of control after I'd been flirting with his friend all evening. He said checking my phone was normal because he'd been worried about me working late so often. He said showing up at Emily's house was just trying to make sure I was safe. His performance was good, too good. I started worrying the judge might actually believe him. Then Chloe stood up to cross-examine. She asked about the credit card. He said he'd opened it for household expenses and that I knew about it. She pulled out bank statements showing the charges were for things like bars and restaurants I'd never been to. He said he couldn't remember every purchase. She asked why he'd used my name and social security number without asking me first. He said it was easier that way. She asked if he thought that was legal. He started getting frustrated. She asked about the restraining order violations. He said sending flowers wasn't a crime. She asked if he'd read the order that specifically said no contact of any kind. He said the order was ridiculous. She asked if he thought he was above the law. His voice got louder. He said I'd turned everyone against him and made him look like a monster when all he'd done was love me too much. The judge told him to lower his voice. Chloe asked if throwing wine in someone's face was how he showed love. He slammed his hand on the witness stand and yelled. She pushed me to it. The judge told him that was enough and excused him from the stand. He walked back to his table, breathing hard, and Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge said she'd take a week to review everything and issue her ruling. We all stood up and filed out of the courtroom. Mark tried to make eye contact with me, but I looked straight ahead and walked past him. Chloe said she thought it went well and that his outburst had probably helped our case more than anything. A week later, Chloe called to tell me the ruling had come through. The judge granted the divorce. She awarded me half the equity in the house, which Mark had to refinance to buy out my share. She assigned him responsibility for the fraudulent credit card debt. I also got to keep my car and my grandmother's jewelry, which he'd been refusing to return. The judge's written ruling included powerful language about recognizing the pattern of controlling and abusive behavior. Reading those words felt like a monumental validation, a powerful acknowledgement that what I'd experienced was real and serious. Mark had 60 days to refinance the house and pay me my share of the equity. Chloe warned me he might try to drag this out or hide assets, but the court order gave us enforcement options if he didn't comply. 6 months after leaving, I received a check for $43,000 from the house refinance. I sat in my apartment, holding the check and crying because it meant I could finally breathe. It was enough to build a real emergency fund and feel financially secure for the first time since I'd left. I used some of the money to pay off my legal fees, which had been hanging over me for months. I put a down payment on a reliable used car to replace the one I'd been sharing with Mark. I bought real furniture for my apartment instead of the secondhand stuff I'd been using. Having my own things in my own space felt like reclaiming my identity piece by piece. Mark made one last attempt to contact me through a mutual friend, asking if we could talk about reconciliation now that the divorce was final. I told the friend to pass along that I had nothing to say and to please respect my boundaries. The friend, well-meaning but misguided, said Mark seemed really broken up about everything and maybe I should give him another chance. I said no, and I hung up. At my next therapy appointment, I told Dr. Eleanor about the contact attempt. She asked how it made me feel. I said mostly angry that he still thought he could manipulate me through other people. She said that was a healthy response and showed how much progress I'd made. We decided to reduce therapy to once a week since my trauma symptoms were becoming more manageable. I still had bad days where the hypervigilance came back, and I checked all my locks 3 times before bed. I still had nightmares about wine dripping down my face and everyone watching. But I also had good days where I felt strong and capable and free. 7 months after I left, Daniel called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. I walked in expecting another project assignment, but he gestured to the chair across from his desk and closed the door behind me. He said he'd been watching my work closely since I'd come back from my time off, and that I'd shown growth he hadn't expected. He said most people going through what I was dealing with would have let their performance slip, but mine had actually improved. He offered me a promotion to senior analyst with a 20% raise and leadership responsibilities for the team's biggest client accounts. I sat there, processing what he just said, because part of me still expected punishment for taking up space or asking for too much. He asked if I needed time to think about it. I said no. I accepted. He smiled and said he'd have HR drop the paperwork and that the promotion would be effective next month. Walking back to my desk, I felt something shift inside me, like maybe I was actually capable of building something good from the wreckage. That evening at the support group, I mentioned the promotion during check-in, and the other women clapped for me. One of them asked if I'd be willing to mentor a new member, Laura, who'd just left her husband 2 weeks ago and was struggling with the same shame spiral I'd been stuck in months before. I said yes without thinking about it, because helping someone else navigate what I'd been through felt like giving purpose to all the pain. Laura had this lost look I recognized from my own mirror 6 months earlier. We exchanged numbers after the meeting, and I told her she could text me anytime, day or night, if she needed to talk or just needed someone to remind her she wasn't crazy. Over the next few weeks, I met with Laura for coffee twice and talked her through the practical steps of separating finances and finding a lawyer. Listening to her story made me realize how far I'd actually come, because the things that had felt impossible to me 7 months ago now felt like basic survival steps I could explain clearly. The support group became the anchor point of my week, the place where I could be honest about the hard days without anyone trying to fix me or tell me to move on faster. 8 months after I left, I was making dinner in my apartment when I realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about Mark. I hadn't checked the locks obsessively or looked over my shoulder in parking lots or rehearsed what I'd say if he showed up somewhere. The hypervigilance that had been my constant companion was fading so gradually I hadn't noticed it leaving. I stood at my kitchen counter, crying into a cutting board full of chopped vegetables, because the absence of fear felt almost as overwhelming as the fear itself had been. I was learning to trust my own judgment again. To believe that when I looked at someone, it was just looking, and not an invitation for punishment. I had a good job that I'd earned through my own work, a safe apartment that was entirely mine, friends who knew what I'd survived and supported me anyway. I was building confidence in recognizing red flags early, in knowing what healthy boundaries looked like, in understanding that love shouldn't require me to make myself smaller. The journey wasn't finished, and I still carried the weight of what had happened in my body's reactions and my careful way of moving through the world. But I'd survived something I wasn't sure I'd survive, and that counted for more than I'd known it could. I was genuinely proud of who I was becoming. Someone who could look at her reflection and see strength instead of shame. This is a story of reclaiming your life, one step, one terrifying decision, and one small victory at a time. It's about finding your voice and trusting yourself after someone tried to silence you. If you've ever found yourself in a similar situation or wondered if you were making the right choice, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes?